Okay, in the 1800s in America, there was a pastor named Henry Ward Beecher. Anybody ever hear of him? So he was part of the abolitionist movement in America, trying to end slavery in America. And his sister was actually Harriet Beecher Stowe. That name may be a little more familiar. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is one of the most widely sold books in English. But anyways, one night during the American Civil War, Pastor Stowe, or Pastor Henry Ward Beecher, was in his home, and a stranger came, knocked on his door, and his wife opened it. And she didn't recognize him. It was cold out. He was all bundled up. She could only see his eyes. And so he said he needed to talk to Pastor Beecher. He didn't give his name, and Mrs. Beecher was a bit concerned because some people had tried to do harm to this man because of his strong abolitionist views. And so she didn't know who it was, so she just closed the door in his face, ran upstairs and said to her husband, "There's somebody at the door that wants to talk to you." And without hesitation, he ran to the door, greeted the stranger, welcomed him in, ended up praying with the man, and that man ended up being Abraham Lincoln, the then president of the United States during the Civil War. You see, President Lincoln came to Pastor Beecher because he was facing a crisis, and he urgently needed prayer for wisdom of what to do next. In a time of crisis, Lincoln knew where to go for help, not just to the pastor, but pastor to help him go to God. And so this pastor helped President Lincoln, pray for wisdom. It's a story to remind us no matter who you are, whether you're the President of the United States, or if you're just a pastor, or if you're anybody, we all need to pray for wisdom in our times of crisis especially. And this brings us to the book of Daniel. We're continuing through the book of Daniel because in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel was in a crisis. His life was in danger, and he desperately needed wisdom. Open your Bibles then to Daniel chapter 2, and we'll look at this crisis and how Daniel handled it. Daniel chapter 2, let's start by reading verse 1 to get the context of what's going on. Daniel 2, verse 1 says, "And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him." So this gives us some context. His crisis began actually with the king of Babylon, with Nebuchadnezzar. It says it was the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So it's hard to get the exact timeline here in Daniel's life, but it most likely means that Daniel was still in those 3 years, or finishing up those 3 years of training. Remember last week, we talked about 3 years he was being brainwashed by the Babylonians. He was being trained to then be presented to the king. And so if this was only the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, depending on how you look at the timeline in relation to chapter 1, this means Daniel was still wrapping up those 3 years of training. Early on in Daniel's life, still a young man, still a teenager, an older teenager. And so Daniel's crisis doesn't begin with him. It begins with something that happened with King Nebuchadnezzar. The king wasn't sleeping well. It wasn't just because of what he ate. God was giving him dreams that were troubling him. He was losing sleep. Next time we'll look specifically at what God was trying to show him through this dream. But for now, we need to realize that he had this dream, or dreams it says, that troubled him. And dreams had significance for the Babylonians. They believed that dreams had some insight into the future. There was some meaning for the dreams. And so Nebuchadnezzar was troubled because of what he was seeing. He was unsure, is this going to be good news or bad news for my future? So he needed somebody to interpret his dream So it would calm him down so he could sleep well knowing what it meant. Now Daniel, we were told in chapter 1 verse 17 that Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams, that he could interpret dreams. So Daniel could have helped the king. But we see in chapter 2 that the king did not call for Daniel. And again, it's possible that the king didn't even know about Daniel at this point because it's only the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. Meaning Daniel was still probably in those 3 years of training. So not even maybe knowing about Daniel, not calling for Daniel, who does he call to help him? In verse 2, he calls in the quote-unquote professionals. His court, his faculty, we might say. Verse 2 says, the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. These men, although they're called by different names, different categories, different types of specialties, they're all considered as a group the wise men of Babylon. That's a phrase used for all of them collectively in verses 13 and 24. So when the king faced his own crisis, he sought wisdom from the wise men, the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. What we need to understand about these men is these were not just some religious, what we say, crackpots, okay? These were educated men. In today's terms, these would be university professors. They examined the stars. They studied books and literature. They may have even developed early types of pharmaceutical medicine. They were able to look at world events and world history and try to establish trends that happened to predict what would happen. These were historians and philosophers. So these wise men that he called, understand these were educated men. And among other things, they claimed to have special abilities to interpret dreams and to predict the future. Based on their intelligence, but also based on what they claimed they had a special connection with the gods, with the Babylonian gods. So when Nebuchadnezzar was losing sleep and he had this troubling dream, he went to these wise men for help. These university professors, these intellectuals. And it's really not too different from the world in which we live today. Because when a crisis happens in the world today, to whom do the people turn first? Let's go to the experts. See what the experts have to say, right? Let's go to the intellectuals who think they have all the answers. In times of crisis, people turn to whom they consider the wise men of this world. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. In the middle of his crisis, he went to who he thought to be the wise men of Babylon. But very quickly we see as the story unfolds, things went from bad to worse. From bad to worse. And the crisis of the king ends up being transformed into the crisis of the wise men, which then transforms into the crisis of Daniel. And it all started because Nebuchadnezzar gave a very difficult, he gave an impossible request. Let's read verses 3 to 6. The king said unto them, he said unto the wise men, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said unto the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. The king was serious. He was serious about finding out what his dream meant. Because typically what would happen, he would go to these wise men, tell them what his dream was, and then they could just make up whatever interpretation they wanted. That's often what they did. They said, well, based on what we know of certain things, this is what your dream means. There's really no way to verify if what they said was true. So this time the king really wanted to know. Again, this was something that really troubled him. He needed to know the truth of the dream. So he really gives them a test to tell if they really could interpret the dream. First, show me what the dream actually is. And I don't think here that the king forgot the dream. I think he was testing them to know if they truly could give a good interpretation, a right interpretation. And the test was simple but extreme. To display that you have true wisdom, tell me my dream and the interpretation. And if you can't, you're dead. That's the test. That's what he proposed. This test would reveal that these wise men were actually indeed frauds, imposters. We say in English, charlatans, claiming to be one thing, but in reality they are not. So the king's crisis, he was already in a crisis. He couldn't figure out what this dream meant. Now his crisis is turning into the crisis of the wise men, because now their life is on the line. The king in his crisis turned to the wise men for wisdom, and now the wise men need to find a way out. So who do they turn to in their time of crisis? There weren't other wise men to turn to, so they try to turn back to the king, the one who had power to stop this. They try to plead with him to be reasonable. This is an unreasonable request, is what they essentially said to him. Let's read verses 7 to 13 to see what happens. Verses 7 to 13. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. He said, let's do what we always do. The king answered and said, I know of certainty that you would gain the time, because you see the thing is gone from me. But if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you, for you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me the interpretation thereof. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king requires, and there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. The king had had enough. They were pleading with him to be reasonable. There's no way we could do this. Notice the irony here. They said, you need to have a special connection with the gods to know this, and that was something that they claimed to have. And so he realizes that they are not who they claim to be. He realizes they can't help him. Maybe even paranoid, they were plotting against him. And so he orders their execution in a fit of rage. Verse 12, he was very angry, he was very furious. And so the king gave the command to execute all the wise men of Babylon, not just the ones he was talking to, but all of them. And that would include Daniel and his friends. So the crisis had grown, and now Daniel was involved. Up to this point, Daniel probably really had no idea what was happening until the guards came to him and said, hey, we got to kill you and all the wise men. But once he heard about the situation, once he heard about the dream, we see the steps that Daniel took to end the crisis. This crisis was growing. It had come to Daniel's door, and now we see how he handles it. Again, Nebuchadnezzar's request was unreasonable. It was not humanly possible. No human can know the dream of another human. I can't guess what you dreamt about last night. I can't know, well, I can guess, I can't know with a surety what any of you dreamt about. No human can know the dream of another human unless it was told to them. So the wise men were correct in what they said in verse 10. In verse 10, they said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. That's a true statement. No man could do this. No man could see into the mind of another man to know what he dreamt about. The king's request required what we call omniscience. You guys know what omniscience means? It means having all knowledge. Omniscience. All science, where we get the word science, is knowledge. Omniscience is having all knowledge. No human being is omniscient. Therefore, Daniel turned to the only one who is omniscient, and that is God himself. He turned to God himself, the only omniscient one. The answer wouldn't come, as they said, it would not come from any man upon the earth, as the wise men had said. Rather, it must come from the God of heaven above. And that's what he does. Let's read verses 16 to 18. 16 to 18. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Daniel addresses God here as the God of heaven. That's the title he uses, the God of heaven. It's a title to acknowledge that God is supreme over everything. In order for him to be supreme over everything, it means he must know everything. He must be truly omniscient. He's addressing the omniscient God by saying, the God of heaven. Only God is omniscient. When I was a child, we would tease the smart kids by saying they're Mr. Know-It-All or Mrs. Know-It-All. But God is the only one who is truly a know-it-all, the one who truly knows it all. He knows all things, past, present, and future. And he even knows man's thoughts. This means that things that are hidden from man are not hidden from God. It means nothing is hidden from him, including a man's dream. In this case especially, since God's the one that put it there. But God knows all things in the mind. Verse 22 reveal that. Verse 22 we'll look at in just a minute, but verse 22 is Daniel saying this about God. He says, God reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. It means certain things may be hidden from us as humans with our limited understanding, or unclear to us, but God knows it all. God reveals it all because he is completely omniscient. He's completely all-knowing. God's omniscience is a wonderful thing. And that is something that the psalmist admits in Psalm 139. It would be good for us just to turn there quick. Keep your finger in Daniel 2. Turn to Psalm 139. God's omniscience is too wonderful for us to fully understand. Psalm 139. Psalm 139, we're going to read verses 1 to 6. As we read this, just dwell on God's omniscience. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my downsitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou compassest my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, you know it altogether. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain unto it. That's what the psalmist says. He says, basically, God's omniscience is something, his knowledge is too wonderful for us to understand. It means it's something that's both overwhelming, but at the same time comforting, to know that God knows it all. And so as we go back to Daniel 2, Daniel understood that he needed this wonderful wisdom from God. He knew that God was omniscient and that God could give him the wisdom he needed to save him in this crisis, this life or death crisis. That's why in verse 18 he calls it says companions, the other three we looked at last week. In verse 17, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He calls them together to join him in asking God, praying to God for God to give mercies concerning this dream, to be merciful, to show him what the dream means. Share that omniscience with his omniscience to show, reveal what they cannot see. In times of crisis, we're to do the same thing, to seek God's mercies. Seek mercies from the God of heaven, it says. Because it's by God's mercy and grace that he gives us the wisdom we need to make our decisions. In times of crisis, Daniel knew to whom to turn. He was different from the wise men. In verse 10, the wise men, all they could do is plead with the king. But in verse 18, Daniel pleaded with the omniscient one, the God of heaven. And God, in his mercy, he truly was merciful in this. He gave Daniel the wisdom to understand the king's dream. Verse 19. Verse 19 in Daniel 2. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. God delivered Daniel from his crisis by revealing the dream, by giving him the wisdom to understand the dream. And Daniel responds with a beautiful prayer of praise. Let's read verses 20 to 23. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has made known unto me now what we desired of you. For you have made known unto us the king's matter. A beautiful praise, and Daniel indicates a few things about God in his praise. Number one, that wisdom, true and complete wisdom, belongs to God. Verse 20, notice he's saying that wisdom and might are his, possessive. Wisdom and might belong to God. Wisdom and might are God's. This means that God is both the source and the holder of true wisdom. True wisdom. In the Aramaic here, and I'll talk about that next week, the fact that it switches from Hebrew to Aramaic. But in the Aramaic here, the words wisdom and might are in the determined or emphatic state. It's like putting the word the in front of it, the definite article the, to say it's the exact thing. Like in Hebrew, you put the hey in front of the word to make the determined state. So it's like saying here, because in English it's translated as wisdom and might are his, but it's almost like saying the wisdom and the might are his. Almost as if to say there's a wisdom that's unique to God, that's specifically God's. It's a wisdom that's different from Babylon's wisdom. It's a wisdom that's different from the world's wisdom. It's a wisdom that comes from God himself. He has a unique wisdom. We need to realize, too, as New Testament believers, that that wisdom is revealed in Jesus Christ, in Yeshua. 1 Corinthians 1:30 tells us that. 1 Corinthians 1:30 says, But of him are you in Christ Jesus, who of God is made unto us wisdom. Yeshua is wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, but he's made unto us wisdom. That is what we have by believing in Yeshua. We have wisdom. And we need God's wisdom, especially in our times of crisis. We need Yeshua in our times of crisis. We need Christ in our times of crisis. So Nebuchadnezzar went to the wise men of Babylon looking for wisdom, but he was looking in the wrong place. It wasn't the source of wisdom. He wasn't going to find it there. It's like drilling for oil in Israel, right? There's no oil in Israel. Doesn't matter how hard you try to drill, how much you drill, you can't find oil where there is no oil. And you can't find wisdom where there is no wisdom. If we want wisdom in the middle of our crisis, we need to go to the right source. God is the source of true wisdom. And God, because He's merciful and gracious, is willing to give us that wisdom if we ask. Verse 21, again, he says He gives wisdom to the wise. He gives wisdom. It means He's both the source of wisdom, He's also the giver of wisdom. He's the one that gives wisdom. In verse 23, Daniel thanks God that He gave him wisdom and might. And he thanks God that He made these things known unto him by His wisdom. So we already saw in chapter 1, verses 4 and 17, that there was a reference to Daniel's wisdom. Now in chapter 2, the source of his wisdom is revealed, coming from God Himself. His wisdom came from God. Men who are truly wise men are those who have been given wisdom from God. Those astrologers, those magicians, they had a type of wisdom. It was a type of wisdom that came out of scrolls and textbooks. But Daniel's wisdom came from a different place, came from God Himself. And that type of wisdom, to receive that type of wisdom from God, should cause us to respond as the psalmist did. To understand that such wisdom is indeed too wonderful for us to fully understand. To also be like Daniel and to praise God for giving such wisdom, especially in the middle of our crisis. To be like Daniel, repeat his words in verse 20. You say, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are His." To acknowledge, as Daniel did in verse 23, "I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and have made known unto me now what we desired of you." He desired wisdom. He desired the wisdom to know the dream, to save him in his crisis. And God gave it to him. Daniel reminds us over and over, and we're going to see that throughout this book, this isn't a book about Daniel. This is a book about the God of Daniel and all that He enables Daniel and his friends to endure. It was God's wisdom that allowed Daniel to interpret the king's dream. It was God's wisdom that saved Daniel's life and ended his crisis. God's the source of wisdom. Wisdom and might are His, again in verse 20. And He's willing to give that wisdom. Verse 21. What do we need to do? We simply need to ask for that wisdom. We need to desire it as Daniel did and his friends. As believers in Yeshua, we have the promise of James chapter 1. James 1 verses 5 and 6. James 1, 5 and 6 says, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that gives to all men liberally and upbraids not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavers is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed." The formula is simple. Ask and you shall receive. Ask God for wisdom, for His wisdom, and He'll give it to you, and give it to you, it says, liberally, graciously, generously. But the caveat here is ask in faith, believing that He will give and He will guide us. Daniel understood this principle. In the middle of his crisis, he had the perfect plan, and that plan was simply to pray. He took the time to pray, to ask for God's wisdom. When we're in a crisis and we don't know what to do, that is our avenue, to pray for God's wisdom. When we're in a crisis and we think we know what to do, that's also the time to pray for God's wisdom. We can never go wrong by praying for God's wisdom in any situation. One commentator stated it well. He said, when things are hopeless, pray. When things are darkest, pray. When you have no idea what to do next, pray. I want to close by talking about what can happen when we don't take this avenue, when we don't ask God, don't pray and ask Him for wisdom. Because let's take a moment to understand the snowball effect of not going to God immediately when we're in a crisis, when we delay going to God in prayer. You guys know what the snowball effect is? Some of you maybe have never seen snow. Snowball is, you make a snowball by adding snow to the ball, or usually you roll it if you want to get it like a snowman going. And so it builds. The snowball builds. One thing adds to another and gets bigger and bigger. That's the snowball effect. So in Daniel chapter 2, there was a snowball effect. One crisis was building upon another. The snowball kept growing. Remember, it started with King Nebuchadnezzar. He had a crisis. He had a dream that troubled him. He needed an interpretation. He couldn't find it. So he went to the wise men of Babylon. They couldn't help him. He was still troubled. And now his crisis was turning into the wise men's crisis because now they were threatened with death. He threatened to kill them if they couldn't interpret his dream. The crisis is growing. They tried to plead with him. They didn't go to God. They tried to plead back to the king. King, be reasonable. But that didn't help. The king was still angry, and he eventually ordered for them to be killed. So the snowball kept growing. The crisis kept growing. And the more they looked for answers in the wrong place, the crisis grew. And now the crisis brought in Daniel. The king's crisis grew into the wise men's crisis, which then grew into Daniel's crisis. The snowball continued to grow because nobody found the wisdom to end it. Nobody knew to turn to God until the crisis reached Daniel. He was the one that knew what to do. He was the one that knew where to turn, to whom to turn, to God Himself. He didn't turn to the wise men. He didn't turn to the wisdom of the world. He didn't turn to the king of the world. Rather, he turned to the God of heaven. In Daniel's time of crisis, he turned to God because he knew that God is the source of wisdom. Only then, only when someone finally turns to God in their crisis, will the crisis end. In this case, it ended for everybody instantly. The crisis was over, not just for Daniel, but all the wise men. And Daniel, interestingly, later in the verses said, don't just spare my life, but spare all the wise men. An interesting statement. We don't have time to talk about that tonight. But the crisis ended for everybody once he turned to God for his wisdom. By turning to God, the snowball effect, the snowball of crises had come to an end. And the lesson for us is simple. When we're faced with a crisis, no matter how big or how small, don't hesitate to turn to God for wisdom. Don't let that snowball grow. Immediately go to God in prayer. Ask the God of heaven, the omniscient God, for His wisdom. Wisdom that can be found for us in Yeshua. He will graciously give you what you need in your time of crisis because He will give you His wisdom to end your crisis.